we're going to now be looking at this A note and making our intervals around it using this shape, which means we're basically going to be looking at the Aeolian or the minor scale around this note. So remember, one of the ideas here is that we're going to be at the bottom of the guitar. A lot of people don't really think about creating intervals from the bottom of the guitar, which is one of the major ways that you can build chords, is by basically putting together the intervals, the main intervals that we would want to know for a triad being the 1, 3, and the 5. So I want to talk a little bit more about that as we go into basically our intro here to try to get an idea as to why you might want to spend, a few minutes a day, 15 minutes, an hour a day doing an exercise of something like this to try to get some of that theory stuff in our mind so that then we can kind of expand on it when we're doing kind of noodle around practice, more freestyle stuff or whatever we want to do. So remember, the general idea here is that we want to be working on our intervals. We're focusing here on the minor scale, noting that the minor scale could also be thought of as the Aeolian mode, just one of many modes, just like looking at a fractal picture or something like that. There's no better mode when you're perceiving it that way than anything else. It's just like in physics when you're looking at one perspective versus the other perspective. What we want to be able to do is look at it from each of the perspectives, even though the scales that are used the most are gonna be the minor scale, Aeolian mode, and the major scale, the Ionian mode. But we would like to see it in conjunction with all the other modes, in part because that allows us to build chords a lot more easily no matter what mode we're playing in, even if we want to stick to those main two, the major and minor scale, the Ionian mode and the Aeolian mode. So how can we learn those? Well, we're going to start with the major scale typically because, again, in Western music we use that as the key. We might as well keep doing that. As we use it as the key, however, we want to not get stuck thinking about like a convention as though it's a rule, as it's a law. And I just want to put this thought out there. I'm going to compare it to something that I've been kind of thinking about a little bit, which I think has a parallel to it. You might not agree with my thought process on this thing, but you can get the idea, right? And the idea would be, for example, when we were working on scientific understanding of things and looking at the universe and whatnot, it became a good convention to say, hey, look, I'm going to look for the simplest explanation of something, number one, so that's going to be most likely the best outcome will usually come from the simplest explanation. And number two, I'm not going to look for a supernatural cause, but I'm going to try to look for another physical cause in the world as I do tests. And therefore, as a general practice, I'm going to remove like the idea of, well, God did it, right? It was a spiritual thing that caused this thing to happen, right? Now that's a general rule within science that makes sense, but it's not really a law, right? We can't really make a law saying, well, this is actually the way it has to be because it's the simplest thing, right? You can imagine a simple idea of something that isn't correct, that is more simple than a more complex idea. So it's a general rule that scientifically you're going to find the quickest point between two things, a cause and effect, but it's not, you can't apply it all the time. And you can't really say all the time. I mean, you can't rule out with science like a God or something like that either, in my opinion at this point in time, because again, it's hard to see scientifically what's happening from the realm of physical items and think about something that might be outside the realm, right? If you're thinking about multiple dimensions or something like that, you're not going to be able to prove that, scientifically, because now it's outside the realm of the physical realm, right? So it's a general convention to be able to say, what I'm going to do scientifically is I'm going to look for the simplest solution, and I'm going to eliminate basically the acts of God in my explanation so that I can keep drilling down on the complexity of the world to find the physical rationale for things and try to drill that back as far as we can get it without having to resort to supernatural interventions. That makes sense, but again, it's just a convention. And similarly here, what we want to do is use the major scale as kind of like a key, right? The major scale is a key that we can refer back to. It's a general rule to say, okay, that's going to be like the primary scale, and then all of the other modes are basically derived from that major scale. That works because it gives us an angle, a point of reference. But that would be just like saying that if I'm on planet Earth and I'm measuring everything from planet Earth, that planet Earth is the center of the universe. And it's not that way typically, but it's useful to measure that way when I'm in Earth, right, to do many things, right? So similarly with music here, the major scale is what we kind of use to as our perspective, but it's useful to note that obviously all the other modes, you can derive everything from all the other modes. They're just as useful to look at it from basically that perspective. It's a convention to basically say that we're going to use the major scale, which is quite useful for us to do, but it's not like a law, if that makes sense. That's my rant on that. But generally, why does it make sense for us to do it? Because if I learn the major scale intervals, if I learn these intervals, then I can also learn the related modal intervals by basically comparing them to the major scale. The two other major modes, the one that have a major third to them, only have one interval difference, making it easy. And then the minor mode, the Aeolian mode, is basically, you can almost think of it as the opposite of the Aeolian mode. So that means that the perfects remain the same. The majors will be flipped to minors, except for that weird second, which stays major. And then if I can memorize that, then I can compare the other minor modes to the major mode. And there's only going to be one interval difference. Why is that useful? Not only because it lets me play in multiple modes, it also lets me maneuver from chord to chord, no matter what mode I'm playing in, to be able to determine not only it's a major or minor, but also what 7, 9, 11, and 13 will fit into the chord. So that's going to be basically the general outline. So something I'd like to point out in terms of, well, how could you, once we start learning these intervals, one way that you might put this into practice, let's go down to the minor scale and just let me look at the intervals real quick. You've got a 0 note away perfect first, a 2 note away major second, a 4 note away major third, a 5 note away perfect fourth, a 7 note away perfect fifth, a 9 note away major sixth, an 11 note away major seven. If I go down to the minor scale down here, then you've got a 0 note away perfect first, a 2 note away major second, which is the same, even though it's a major second for the minor scale. You've got a 3 note away minor third, flattened third, that's what we expect. 5 note away perfect fourth, 7 note away perfect fifth. Those are the same on the major and the minor. And then we flattened the sixth, 8 note away minor six instead of a major six, and a 10 note away flattened minor seven instead of an 11 note away major seven. So that's the general idea. Now, one thing that you might kind of do to put this into practice generally is obviously when you start to notice that I've color coded the minors, the 1, 3, 5 of the A minor here as the 1 is green, the 5 is yellow, and then the 3 is red. So one thing you can do is, of course, build chords from the bottom by basically using your intervals, being able to count the intervals, and then measure each of them from the root note. So how would I do that practically? Clearly, what I would normally start doing is saying, okay, I'm in whatever mode I'm in. If I'm in the Aeolian mode, I can go in here and look for all my A notes, and then I can basically look for the 1, 3, 5 relationship and start building chords from it, and then I can expand on that by going to the 7, 9, 11, and 13. If I'm in A minor and then I go to like the 3, for example, that means I'm basically playing the C, which if I'm in the same key will be a major modal chord, meaning if I started from the C, I would be playing a major chord. So I could stay on this worksheet and say, well, now, like if I'm going to a C up top, I could use my intervals and measure the 1, 3, 5 from using this as my center point. I could use this same worksheet, or if I want to color code it like this, I can say, well, now when I go up to the 3, of the minor scale, I can scroll up and say, well, I'm basically playing a major modal chord. So you can go up to this worksheet and say, now I'm building the 135 because I've color coded that up here as the 135 and make it a little bit easier to see. But see what I'm doing is I'm thinking of myself in the key of A minor. It's just that I went to the C as it relates to A minor in my chordal progressions. And when I go to the C, I'm going to think of it as a major modal chord, right? And then if I go back down if I'm playing in A minor, then I go back to the A minor, right? And then if I wanted to go to the D, notice it's a Dorian modal chord, which I can see right here. These are all the notes in the Dorian modal chord. Or I can go up to the 2 of my modes, right? And say, here's the Dorian as though it's the first, so that I have it color coded with the 135. So you see how they're all related. That'll make it a little bit easier possibly for me to see these other notes that are involved. Now you can also do this the other way, which I would recommend, playing with, and that would be, let me just find different fingerings on the guitar and then see if I can determine what I might name that chord, right? Instead of first thinking about the chord that I want to find and then finding it, looking for the root note and building a chord around it. Maybe first I'm just going to say, hey, this whole shape, all these colored notes are in my shape. Let me go into the shape and I'm just going to grab whatever I can. I'm going to think about it in 3 notes at a time to build some kind of triad chord. And then I'll go back in and try to figure it out. Now, as you do this, it's useful to think about 3 notes at a time. Like you might pick like the middle of the guitar, like these 3 strings, right? Because I'm using 3 fingers. So I'm going to try to pick 3 strings. I can't fret 2 things at a time if I'm building a chord. So there's only so many combinations that you could have, right? So if I'm like in the middle of the guitar and I'm looking at like these 3 strings, maybe I start on the G string, and what are the different ways I can do it? Usually people think about going below it here down to here, but if I want to stay in these 3 strings, I would go up top here and then below it, right? So now I've got, if I'm here, I'm going here, and then I'm going up top here, and then I'm reaching over here, right? Now that's kind of like, wait a sec, I need to be reaching out here. Did I do that right? Yeah. No, wait a sec. I went, wait a second, what am I doing here? It goes here, here, and then here. That's what I was doing. So notice, and then you can kind of figure that out. It's like, oh wait, there's 2 E's in that one. And then you can kind of look at the intervals related to them. So I'm trying to pick a fingering structure that I don't use like all the time, right? So I can pick like this structure, like this, which I already know is like an A minor. So the ones that are going to come to mind are going to be the ones that you're familiar with. But you can start to say, well, what if I reach my finger down this way on this G, and then I reach below it right here, and then it's like, well, what can I do above it? I can go up to here. So now notice what I'm doing is I'm reaching now, instead of reaching down here with this finger, which is the most comfortable thing to do, I'm reaching down with this finger, which gives me more breadth up the guitar. So if I reach it down there, that's going to make it easier for this finger to reach, although I have a big gap here. And now I've got this chord, right? And then I could look for where I can put my pinky down, which would be right here. Is that right? No, right here. So then that's like, okay, that's a weird chord. But now I could measure it using my intervals, right? I can say, well, when could I use that in a practice? And normally I would look at it from the perspective of where my root is. The lowest note in the chord is actually this, right? So I could think of it as an F chord and say, well, then there's a G related to it. How far away is that G? Well, it's going to be, if I count this out, it's going to be 5 here, and then 4, 3, 2. So if I think about it from the perspective of an F, then it's got then I'm going to be playing in the F, which is going to be some kind of Lydian modal chord, right? Because I'm playing on the F, on the Lydian note in this key. So it's going to, and then it's got a 5, 4, 3, 2, a major second, and then it's got 5, 10, and then 9. So it's got a major 6 in it. Or I can measure it from the G. I can think of it as a G chord because it's kind of ambiguous, because you notice that it doesn't have the third. So that if it doesn't have a third in it, it's difficult to say if it's major or minor. It's kind of in between. So I could think of it as an F. Maybe when I get to an F, I put that chord in there and see what it sounds like if I have a progression with an F in it, an F chord, just to make it sound a little weird, right? A little different. Or I can measure it from the G, in which case if I measure it from the G, I'm going to say, okay, this is 5 up here, and then we're going to go 5, negative 5, 4, 3, 2. So that means that from the perspective of the G, it has an inverse of a 2. So it would be a 10. So that would be a 10 note away, which would be a minor 7, right? I'm trying to do this fairly quick. And then if I go down below it, I've got 5, 6, 7, a 7 note away, which is a perfect fifth. So again, I can think of it as a G chord and try to think about what kind of G chord basically I'm looking at it, or I can think of it as a D and look at it from that perspective, in which case I've got, like, what is this, a negative 5, negative 6, negative 7. It's an inverse distance because I'm going above it. So 12 minus 7, if I measure it from the D, is a 5 is a 5 note away, which would be a perfect fourth. And then if I go up to this one, I'm looking for the inverse distance, or I can count out the inverse distance, which would be 5, 10, and then 9, and then 12 minus 9 is 3. So there's the third. So if I look at it from the D, then I actually have like a minor third in there. So I could think of it as a D. Actually makes kind of the most sense in this case, even though it's the highest pitched note, because it has the third in it, which, right? So notice that either of those ways of looking at it isn't necessarily wrong. It kind of just depends on what context you're in, right? Because it could sound like an F, even though you can think of it as like some kind of D minor chord, because the F is going to be the lowest note. So it might still work if you're in a progression. Now notice you don't really need to know that in order to noodle around with this shape. Like if I took the same concept, like I'm always starting with my pointer finger here, and then I'm going to reach down to the string below it here, and then I'm going to reach whatever's available above it after that. So I'm reaching down to here. I could reach this one, but I can't really get that if I use my second finger, so I have to go out to here. So it just makes sense just by where I put that second finger in terms of where my third finger is going to go. And that same shape then, if I moved it back and I did the same pattern, I can move it back here. It's useful to just go up and down the guitar and play the same pattern, right? So I can say, okay, it's going to be here. So now if I did that same pattern and then I go back to the next available thing, it's an F, and then I say, what can I reach down below it? Well, I can reach that one. Down below it, the B is right there this time, and that just leads my finger up here to be on the D. So that you get like a tension-y sound there from the perspective of the F, because now you have a flat fifth because you're playing on the F, which is the Lydian mode, which has, you can call it an augmented fourth from the perspective of a Lydian that has the same distance as a flat fifth. And then if I go back to this one, then I'm going to go, okay, if I'm on that one, I basically have the same thing, right? So I can put this finger back, and I'm still reaching here and then here, right? And so I can follow that, and then if I went up from here, I started on the G, and if I do that same pattern, I'm like going to go down here and then up to here, right? I was on here, on the G, down to here, up to here, and then I'm going to go up and say, what can I do with this pattern? If I did the same thing up here, I would be like on the A, and that means I'd reach down to the E, which is going to lead this finger here, right? So if I start on this A, and I'm going to reach down to whatever I can reach in the pattern, that's going to be an E, And then up here, where can my finger go? It can go on the G. So if I start to play that like, right? You can start to play those up and down. You could start to learn those patterns that are a little bit different, not by like figuring out the interval or seeing exactly the chord that you want to play, but just playing the same pattern, just like you do when you're playing like the blues. Because it's the same pattern, basically, it's going to work on the same strings up and back. And in this case, you're playing it, you're not keeping the shape the same. You're changing the shape, but keeping the same idea of I'm going to reach this string down. I'm going to put my finger in this string, and I'm going to reach down here, and then I'm going to put this finger on whatever fits in the pattern. And then I'm going to go to this string, and I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to do whatever fits in the pattern, and then reach up here to whatever fits in the pattern, right? And then I'm going to go here and do the same thing, fit whatever fits in the pattern. And that's going to sound somewhat coherent because it's a similar shape, but you've changed it to fit in the key, so it's always going to fit in the key, and that'll help kind of get the shape down. And again, you can do it, you can then try a different one, right? Like, and then I can go, like I can say, well, what if I reached like up here and then down here? Like, okay, what if I was like here, and I'm like, I'm going to go pointer, and then I'm going to once again reach with this finger instead of this finger up there, which makes this finger have to point out here, and I get to that, and then I could put this other finger down somewhere. And like, okay, what is that? Well, what if I move that same idea up here? Then I'd be on this A, right? And then I would reach up. What can I reach up here? I can reach the C now, which is now here, and then that's going to leave this finger going to whatever fits in the pattern there, right? And now this is kind of it has a 7 in it from the perspective of if you think about this as the root, you've got the 1, 3, and then like a 5. This would be an A minor kind of inverted with a 7, with a 7 in it, basically, right? So if you think about it from the perspective of the A, but you could then, again, then if you want to practice your theory with that, then look at all those weird shapes you've made and try to see, can I look at it from the perspective of each note in the triad as though it's the root, measuring from the perspective of the A, measuring from the perspective of the C, measuring from the perspective of the G. I'm not an expert in that, but that's kind of what I'm kind of noodling around with, because that means that we can, instead of counting this out to something I already know, instead we're looking at something we don't know and then trying to use our ability to count the intervals to think about what the chord is from the perspective of each of these areas, which again, to me, helps us kind of orientate our mind to look from different perspectives, breaking the model of making the convention the rule. The convention isn't the rule. The convention is a convention that we're using to help us with a particular thing, but doesn't work all the time because it's not a universal rule. Physics only has a few rules. I don't know how many rules are in physics, but there's only a few laws. You can't just be making up other laws. They're not laws, they're heuristics. Everything else, heuristics are good, but they're not a law, okay? They're not the law. Okay. Anyways, you start saying a heuristics a law, you're going down the wrong track, man. That's where you get messed up at some point. You're looking at it wrong. Okay.